Let's make some quick comments together about the narrative of Frederick Douglass before the end of the hour. You can take a few notes. The challenge of answering the simple question, how do you explain the fact that men and women were treated in the ways described in the narrative of Frederick Douglass? This is a very difficult question, made more difficult when you point out that the slave owners were by and large devoutly religious men, devoutly religious women. They went to church every Sunday, if you get my drift. In other words, they were, for the most part, by all accounts, apparently, they were pretty decent family people. They were nice to their own children and to their family members. The question is, how do you account for this fact that they could treat other human beings so terribly, as outlined in this reading? One of the traditional answers is, well, the slave owners didn't think of their slaves as human. But we have one small observation that Frederick Douglass helps make apparent in his classic autobiography, and that is, there were no laws against teaching your mule how to read. Think about what I just said. There were no laws against teaching your mule how to read. There were laws against teaching your slave how to read, which seems to suggest that these slave owners from the very beginning understood that a slave was something actually more than a mule, because you had to have a law against teaching your slave how to read. Now, why have a law against teaching your slave how to read? The whole project is about controlling the slaves. If they know how to read, then they might be able to become further educated and therefore more difficult to control. Douglass escapes to the north. It takes him a number of attempts. This is a small cutting from a long book. And once there, he does learn how to read. He is educated. And in the process of being educated, he reads the Declaration of Independence, and it blows his mind that the lines, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal," is in the founding document of America. He publishes the narrative that you've read from, but notice the voice. At no point, at any point in this reading, does he ever say, "Isn't this terrible what they did to me?" Notice it is an unemotional, very rational narrative that simply tells the events as they happened. When this thing is published, it becomes an immediate shocker in the North. Why? Because, as I said at the beginning of my lectures in September, one of the challenges was there was no Walmart when those people showed up. That is to say, they had to figure out how to get their bread. I'll now say, there's no CNN. That is to say, no one in the North understands really what slavery is about. And what Douglass does in his narrative is he gives it a picture. It's an unemotional picture. Well, first he did this, then he did this, then he did this, or they did this. And in the process, the abolitionist movement gains a lot of fire. Why? Because people who had been neutral on the issue of slavery read this, and it does change their opinion of the institution of slavery. Ultimately, of course, the 13th Amendment allows for the freeing of slaves, but first we have to fight a war, a terrible, terrible war over the right to own another person. But I want to point out why I think this text has become so popular into the 20th century. Do you realize the point that Douglass is making? If you are not educated, you are a slave. If you can't read or you can't write, you are held captive and therefore have no freedom, economically speaking. Douglass will also point out that there comes a moment in each of our biographies when whatever it is that's oppressing us, you have to fight against it. Notice what happens when he finally stands up. In that moment, two things happen. One, obviously Mr. Covey will no longer see him the same way ever again. But maybe more importantly, and you get this sense from the very end of the passage that you were just exposed to, more importantly maybe is the fact that Douglass himself is changed. He begins to have a different view of his own manhood, of his humanity. And in that process, he is then forever committed to the idea of freedom. It is significant, as I've said to you before, that we think about the American mentality as don't tell me what to do. Certainly, you get that sense in this passage that there comes a moment, we think here of Emerson's self-reliance, don't we? There comes a moment when it's almost like an epiphany for him, and he realizes, I cannot allow this to happen anymore. I must stand up and I must fight. And of course, that fighting becomes two kinds of fighting, both the individual struggle as well as the collective struggle. That collective struggle we call the American Civil War. And tomorrow we will have some converse about the great moment of that war, probably the most important single moment of that war, at a place called Gettysburg, where two things important happen. One, lots and lots of people die in a tragic battle. But every bit as important are the words that are spoken after that battle by an American president that today we call the greatest president, Abraham Lincoln. I should point out that during this time, no one really understood him to be the great president. There were lots of people who, in fact, were very opposed to who and what he stood for. It would only be later that we would begin to celebrate Lincoln for the great president that he was. Of course, Steve Spielberg's most recent film, Lincoln, as well helps to celebrate that very thing. Thank you.